Hello Hearts of Iron 4 players, my name's Riemann, and today I'll talk about resistance and compliance. These new systems are, by far, the most important part of patch 1.9, and as such, it's very important to know how they work and what the best strategies are for dealing with them. I'll answer a bunch of questions, like what is the best suppression template, and when should I use the different occupation policies, along with many others. I'll also present a lot of comparative charts like this one, so you can get a sense of how these systems work both in theoretical contexts and in practical ones. There's lots to cover, so let's get started. Prior to patch 1.9, the best way to occupy conquered nations was very simple. You'd spam out a bunch of single battalion cavalry divisions, then paint the map with garrison orders, whereupon your Mongolian cavalry horde would descend upon the land like a plague of locusts. 95% of the time, it was best to use the harshest occupation law, which would give you 100% of the factories and resources immediately. Partisans would never be an issue, and any areas conquered could essentially be forgotten about for the rest of the game. Now, that's all changed. Garrisons are now off-map, meaning they only exist within menus. Furthermore, occupation has been split into resistance, how aggressively the population is fighting you, and compliance, how much they're willing to do what you want. Resistance takes the form of attacks on your garrison troops, and possibly sabotaging factories, infrastructure, and resources in the state. If it gets too bad, the nation will rebel and get all its territory back, but that shouldn't happen in a normal game. On the other hand, compliance takes the form of greater access to factories, resources, and manpower within the state, along with other bonuses like greater spy detection, reduced garrison requirements, and even the possibility of a collaboration government. I'll talk about all that stuff in a bit. For now, I'll focus on resistance. Every occupied state has a resistance target, which is calculated by various factors that you can see on screen. The resistance target can be thought of as an equilibrium point, where if resistance is below its target, it will rise up to that level, and if it's above its target, it will decay to that level. Most of the things that influence the resistance target are stuff you'd expect. The primary way you deal with this is deciding which occupation law to use, and by extension, how much emphasis you put on compliance over things like casualty reduction or short-term factories and resources. Something important to note here that might not be immediately obvious is that you'll encounter much more resistance in areas capitulated from the Allies than you would from other areas like the Axis or Comintern, due to higher resistance targets from capitulation and government in exile. As Germany, you'll find far more partisans in Belgium, Denmark, and France than you would in the USSR, because a nation like France will merely go into exile in the UK and rapidly build up legitimacy for up to plus 30% to the resistance target in all its core states, whereas the Soviets won't do any of that. When the Soviets capitulate, you get a peace conference where you can annex things without needing to deal with governments in exile. As resistance grows in your states, partisans will start attacking your garrisons. The frequency of these attacks is dictated by the simple equation of the state's resistance times the weirdly specific number set in the defines of 0.312. When attacks occur, they deal damage to the manpower and equipment of the state's garrison through the following formulas. For casualties, it's 1.8% of the manpower in the garrison times 1 minus the hardness times other modifiers. Equipment losses are a bit higher, at 2% of the equipment in the garrison, times 1 minus the hardness, times other modifiers. The precise numbers here aren't important to memorize. Rather, the important conclusion is that there are several ways of reducing the casualties your garrisons take from resistance combat. You can get modifiers that reduce the damage, you can increase the hardness of a division, or you can reduce the size of the garrison itself. This last point is especially non-obvious, as there's nothing in the UI that readily tells you that smaller garrisons take fewer casualties. It begs the question, what governs garrison size? The equation for how much suppression states need is at 0.75 times the state's resistance, times other modifiers. The minimum for this equation is 10, so even states with 0 resistance need some amount of garrison. The maximum is 50, so between 10 resistance and 50 resistance, the amount of manpower and equipment used by garrisons will increase linearly until the garrison size caps out at 50 resistance. And boy does 50 resistance hurt. You can see garrison combats by clicking this button here, which shows you just how painful 50 plus resistance can be. States get an extra modifier that doubles garrison damage at 50 resistance, and the result can often be catastrophic if you don't optimize your garrison templates. If you use normal combat divisions as your garrisons, then you can end up taking hundreds of thousands and possibly even millions of casualties per year just by occupying Western Europe. Some amount of resistance is going to be inevitable no matter what you do, but good Garrison templates are key to reducing the damage it causes as much as possible. From the equations I showed earlier, the essence of optimizing Garrison templates is that you want the greatest amount of suppression for the least amount of manpower and equipment cost as possible. Then, as a second dimension, you can add hardness to the division, which makes it more expensive, but preserves manpower more effectively. Before we continue, I'll answer some questions that I personally had when I first started designing garrisons. Question 1. Do field hospitals reduce garrison casualties or give trickleback? The answer, no. Upon testing, it doesn't appear that field hospitals do anything for garrison divisions other than run around getting shot, so don't use them. Question 2. Do garrisons use fuel if you give them vehicles or templates that normally require it? The answer, no. Fuel use is abstracted away for garrisons, so don't let that be a factor in which templates you use. Question 3. Does the quality of equipment help you fight resistance more effectively? For example, do you get anything by using 1942 rifles instead of 1936 rifles? The answer? No, you don't get any benefits, since suppression is only predicated on equipment type, not equipment quality. In fact, you get a penalty because modern equipment tends to be more expensive. Some things like armored cars do get more hardness for modern types, but the extra cost is almost never worth it, so always use the cheapest stuff you can. Question 4. Do other stats matter for garrison templates like HP, soft attack, reliability, etc.? The answer, no. While all of those stats would matter for normal combat, garrison combat is completely different and only relies on suppression, manpower, equipment cost, and hardness. Question 5. Does the size of the garrison template matter? The answer, yes, but only if you're using the military police support company. If you remember back to my video on why 40 wits are better than 20 wits, you'll recall that one of the reasons big divisions are better is that they make more efficient use of support companies. In this case, the MP support company has a constant cost no matter how big the division is, so you have no reason not to maximize the benefits it provides by packing in as many battalions as possible, assuming you have some land XP sitting around to do so. This works because states can use fractions of garrison templates, which wasn't the case before. If, for some reason, you're not using MP companies, then no, template size has no effect. A cav division with a single cav battalion is functionally identical to a 25 battalion cav division for the purposes of suppression. Alright, enough beating around the bush. What is the best suppression template? Well, there's no one right answer anymore, as it comes down to a trade-off between protection and affordability. There's 4 options to choose from. Ordering them from most affordable to most protective, it goes cavalry, interwar armored cars, Great War tanks, and 1939 medium tanks. To start, the cheapest division is cavalry, which has 2 suppression per battalion of 1,000 men. All it requires are some guns, and the minimal support equipment for the MP company. Guns are very inexpensive, and you're probably producing a huge surplus of them anyways. In theory, you could have some factories dedicated to making 1918 infantry kits, but in reality that would probably be a waste, as there's not really a way to ensure that only outdated equipment is used in garrisons. It's also possible to capitulate enemies so quickly that you never have to produce guns, in which case cavalry essentially costs no production whatsoever. However, that would be a bit of an edge case, so for purposes of comparison throughout the rest of this video, I'll just assume that cavalry uses 1936 infantry kits. Next up, for a lot more protection, we have the interwar armored car. These cost over 3 times what cavalry does for equivalent suppression, but at 65 hardness and 200 manpower instead of 500 per suppression point, it'll only take around 14% of the manpower damage that cavalry would. Then there's Great War tanks, which cost slightly less than twice as much as armored cars, while taking slightly less than half the casualties. And finally, medium tanks are about 40% more expensive than Great War tanks, while giving twice as much protection. The benefits from hardness are capped at 90 for suppression divisions, so there's no reason to ever use things like super heavy tanks for garrisons. No matter which you use, you should always fill all 25 battalions for your garrison division and use the MP support company as I stated previously. Garrisons are also a good place to use up old equipment. For example, if you have leftover light tanks from the early years, then you can mix those into garrisons to reduce casualties a bit. You'd never want to produce new ones to add to garrisons though, nor would you want to build equipment for any other type of garrison battalion, because everything else will pretty much be a straight downgrade from the 4 battalion types that I've mentioned. For example, mechanized requires more manpower and is more expensive than armored cars while providing less hardness. If you want some protection but can't afford wholesale replacement of all your garrison divisions, you have two options. First, you can upgrade just a few battalions in your garrison division. Alternatively, you can use a second division that's entirely upgraded, but only use it in a few states or nations while your cheaper division is used everywhere else. These are both functionally equivalent methods if you can only afford a few factories to build upgraded garrison equipment. In general, I'd say that I typically prefer going for less protection in my garrisons than some players. Unless I'm completely awash in factories, I'll typically only go up to armored cars, and many times I'll stick with regular cavalry for a long time. I find that newer players generally tend to overestimate the value of manpower, but it would obviously depend based on what type of nation you're playing and what your current situation is, so you'll have to make a judgment call. Alright, now let's shift gears and talk about compliance. It starts at 0 and grows very slowly depending on your occupation law. It grows slower the more of it you have. So for example, on civilian oversight, getting from 0 to 10 compliance takes 143 days, or less than half a year, whereas going from 70 to 80 compliance takes 814 days, which is well over 2 years. It also grows slower if the enemy nation has a government in exile. So again, capitulated nations in the allied faction like Denmark will have their compliance grow slower than the land you take from the USSR. At 0 compliance, you get just 35% of the resources, 25% of the factories, and 2% of the manpower from an area. At 100 compliance, you get a baseline of 60% more resources, 65% more factories, and 18% more manpower, along with minus 50% to the resistance target. You also get extra bonuses at certain thresholds, the most important of which is that you get an extra 10% to both resources and factories when you get to 40% compliance. When you put all the bonuses together, at 100% compliance, you can expect 100% of the factories, 105% of the resources, yes, you do get extra, and about a quarter of the recruitable population as you would expect from a core. Although I want to put a massive asterisk next to this last point, because the way manpower gain is implemented means you'll almost certainly receive far less than this. In most cases, you'll get basically nothing. Let me give an example of this. As Luxembourg, I take over Belgium, and from both the states that have 100 compliance, I get over 100,000 manpower, like the tooltip says. But let's try this again and have Belgium deploy some manpower in 2 divisions first, and then capitulate it like last time. The tooltip still says I'm getting over 100,000 men, but my manpower pool doesn't go up. As it turns out, the UI is bugged and is displaying incorrect information here. If any manpower is used up from the states before you conquered them, that comes out of the total you'll have available to you post-conquest. Say you and an enemy are both on 10% conscription and you take over their states that have full compliance. Say the enemy used 2% of their manpower. In this case, the UI would say you're still getting around a full quarter of the 10% conscription law on their states, which is 2.5%. But in reality, the 2% that had been used would be deducted first, so you'd only get 0.5%. The AI often uses much more than just 2%, so in many states you'll get practically no manpower at all. The only area where you can consistently get a good amount is India, which has a high population and is typically locked to low conscription laws. Next, let's talk about the occupation laws themselves. Laws that generate more compliance will give much fewer resources and factories early, but will give more in the long term and have fewer difficulties with resistance. Laws can be applied across all occupied territories, to specific countries, or even down to individual states, just like Garrison templates. There are 11 laws in total, and like every mechanic in grand strategy games that gives you lots of options, there are several that are basically useless, or at least excessively niche that they can be ignored in normal games. Let's get those out of the way first. The no garrison policy is basically a joke. It means no garrison will be needed, but also disables compliance gain entirely and gives a huge increase to the resistance target. If used on an entire country, then it will possibly get a full rebellion, and all that territory will turn back into an enemy. It's also not worthwhile to selectively use it. For example, using normal laws on states that have resources and factories, and using no garrisons on states that have neither, because the resistance target bleeds between states, causing problems everywhere. In addition, any lands with no garrison will have all their buildings and infrastructure burnt to the ground, interfering with the auto-repair queue. Next up, the martial law policy specializes in reducing resistance, but it can never go below the minimum target of 10% without compliance, which is still quite painful since this policy requires far larger garrisons and takes far more damage than other laws like local police. Resistance equilibrates to its target quite quickly, so there's little reason to use this as a short-term gambit to reduce resistance temporarily, then switch to a different law. There's also little reason to use this in the long term, since compliance gain goes down to almost nothing, and it provides almost no bonuses to the baseline of what you get from occupations. Fascists get a special version of this with brutal oppression that's bad for the same reasons. Both of these should generally be avoided. Next, the military governor policy specializes in providing a baseline of manpower from occupations at the expense of everything else. It's bad for 3 reasons. The first is that occupations usually give a lot less manpower than the bugged UI claims it does, as I explained earlier. The second problem is that the law itself is bugged. I'm almost certain that the bonus manpower was meant to be an additive modifier, such that the 98% penalty to manpower from non-core would become 90% with this law active, as that would be in line with what compliance does, and the relative strength of other occupation laws. Instead, it's a multiplicative modifier, such that the 98% penalty only goes down to 97.8%. In other words, this law is 50 times weaker than what it should be. Third, even if this law was working correctly, it'd still have the downside of requiring a larger garrison, which makes it self-defeating. What's the point of recruiting some soldiers if you immediately lose them to higher garrison requirements and higher casualties from resistance attacks that result? For the last bad law, there's secret police, which gives up a little bit of everything to get higher spy detection. The problem is that the AI doesn't use spies enough to consistently justify this policy. It's not quite as bad as the others, but it's still not worth using a majority of the time. With all that said, I'm not saying all these laws are completely useless. If you tried to come up with some sort of use case, you'd probably be able to find a few. But they're bad enough that I don't find them to be worth discussing at length, which makes discussing the remaining 6 easier to do. The policies that are actually useful are as follows. Civilian oversight, the default long-term law that prioritizes compliance, getting less out of occupations early on, but making up for it with better returns in the long run. Local autonomy, the upgrade to civilian oversight that's only available to democracies. Local police force, a modification of civilian oversight that minimizes the cost of resistance attacks in exchange for less compliance gain. Forced labor and harsh quotas, short-term laws that don't generate compliance but give more resources or factories respectively up front. And liberated workers, a combined and upgraded version of the short-term laws that's only available to communists. Here's a chart showing how compliance grows over time. Not shown here are forced labor and harsh quotas, which will stay at 0 compliance in normal situations. This and subsequent charts show 8 years for the sake of completeness, but 8 years is a long, long time in Hearts of Iron 4. The real World War II only lasted for 6 years, and if anything, the war is typically shorter in this game than it was historically. Keep this in mind as you judge whether to prioritize short-term occupation policies or long-term ones. Of course, seeing just compliance doesn't help us much when we're actually concerned with resources and factories. Let's start with resources first. At 0 compliance, states provide a base of 35% of their resources. The forced labor policy gives another 40% boost for a total of 75% of the resources, represented by this green line. Since compliance typically won't grow with this policy, it remains static over time. In contrast, civilian oversight starts low and then rises up as time passes, overtaking forced labor at around the 2.5-year mark. Note that this jump you see represents the bonuses from reorganized workforce coming online at 40 compliance. If you're prioritizing a reduction in resistance damage, you'll pay the price like this, with local police only overtaking forced labor after about 6 years. The special law for democracies acts as a straight upgrade from civilian oversight, although the strongest policy for resource production overall belongs to liberated workers, which starts only slightly below forced labor and rapidly rises above it. As you can see, the special laws available to communists and democracies are far better than anything the fascists or non-aligned nations have access to. Looking at factories now, default occupation provides a base of 25%, and harsh quotas gives another 25% for a total of 50%. This lower threshold means civilian oversight overtakes the short-term law a bit quicker for factories than it does for resources, in slightly less than 2 years. Local police still does it far slower in 3.5 years. And the special laws are again better than any of the others, but this time local autonomy is clearly in the lead. But this chart doesn't show the whole picture because unlike for resources, for equipment, it's important to understand the stock and the flow. So here's a chart that gives a proxy for the total amount of equipment produced. The y-axis is a cumulative sum of the percent of factories, which I use to dodge around the issue of production modifiers. In-game results will be a bit different depending on things like focuses, conscription law, technology, etc., but this should be at least a good ballpark estimate. Of particular note is the fact that civilian oversight only overtakes harsh quotas in cumulative equipment produced after 3 years, which is quite a long time. Things get even tougher when government in exile is factored in. Since exile legitimacy hurts compliance growth, it weakens civilian oversight to the point where it takes over 4 years for industry to reach break-even with the short-term occupation policies. But at the same time, resistance will also be higher, which will hurt the short-term policies more because they take more damage from resistance attacks compared to civilian oversight. All this together means it's not immediately obvious to me that you should always use short-term or long-term laws. If you're in a game with a short time horizon, like a mid-game achievement or competitive multiplayer, then short-term would probably win. Whereas if you're in one of the game's many pseudo-world conquest achievements, then one of the long-term laws is probably better. Since there are so many confounders when it comes to resistance and compliance, I wanted to do a test of losses sustained under different circumstances. The results are shown here. I want to stress that these were all just single trials, and Garrison combat inherently involves a fair degree of randomness. But the results should give at least a general ballpark of what you can expect. The first cluster is the control group that details how many casualties were taken in the subsequent 3 years after 3 nations were annexed, when I ran cavalry suppression divisions with civilian oversight. You can see losses are somewhat high in the first year, but then trail off quite a bit in years 2 and 3. The next cluster shows what happens when I switch to the local police policy, with casualties being reduced by approximately a factor of 3. The third cluster shows what things look like with the short-term laws. Interestingly, it appears that the effects of the higher garrison requirements and garrison damage taken cancel out with the lowered resistance target to make the first-year casualties very close to those suffered by civilian oversight. The major difference here is that the short-term laws don't generate compliance, so they'll continue to experience first-year levels of casualties year after year. Finally, in the last cluster, you can see that using armored cars reduces casualties to about 14% of what the cavalry templates took, which is a fairly good demonstration of their value. Here's the charts of the equipment losses in those same trials. To be honest, I have no clue what's going on here. The casualties charts all follow the theoretical equations set out in the game's defines file pretty closely, but these equipment ones don't. I'd expect the clusters to follow the same ratios as manpower lost, but that's clearly not the case. For example, going from civilian oversight to local police reduced manpower casualties by a factor of 3, as we saw previously, but equipment losses only decreased by around 35 to 40%. I'm not sure if there's some weird rounding going on in the equipment side of Garrison combat or what, but whatever the case is, these are the results I got. The final point I'll talk about in this video is collaboration. This is a modifier that can only be built by spies, and it serves as one of the best ways to get compliance. Every time you run the mission, you'll get 30 or 45 collaboration, which translates to 30 or 45% compliance immediately when you capitulate the enemy. You can run the operation multiple times to get up to 100 collaboration. With collaboration, the enemy also gets a reduction in their surrender threshold of up to 30% at 100 collaboration. So normal countries capitulate when they've lost 50% of their victory points instead of 80%. Note that these operations are expensive both in time and factories. Not only do you need to build a spy agency, which isn't cheap, but it also requires extra equipment and factories for each mission. However, the rewards are so powerful that it easily justifies its cost on larger nations. Cost and time do not scale to nation size, so use it on the bigger countries. For example, if you're playing Germany, do it on Poland, France, and the Soviets, or those with important resources like Portugal and Romania. Then do a normal capitulation and occupation on the littler guys like Luxembourg, Denmark, and Belgium. This operation is so powerful that there's a good argument to be made that it is the only operation your spies should be running in single player. Seriously, the difference between starting with 100 compliance and 0 compliance can be measured on the order of hundreds of factories, hundreds of resources, and hundreds of thousands of casualties prevented from resistance. Note that this feature is only available to people who bought the Law Resistance DLC, so hopefully you did that. Otherwise you won't have access to one of the best ways of dealing with the new occupation system. Collaboration spy missions also dovetail into collaboration governments, which are new to this patch as well. At 80% compliance, you can get the event to set up a collaboration government. It's technically possible to get up to this compliance threshold naturally over time, but in all practical circumstances, the only way to get these is to use the collaboration mission 2 or 3 times. If you accept the event, then you release all occupied enemy cores into a new nation that acts like a really buggy integrated puppet with some special modifiers. The fact that you can do this during war is pretty cool, and there are definitely some circumstances where they can be useful. Comparing them to regular occupation at 100 compliance, their upsides include that they require no garrison. They have no compliance drop nor resistance gain from government in exile. You get to use their full manpower through puppet templates rather than a tiny fraction. And you get to use all their build slots, they have a generic focus tree which can give them free factories and infrastructure, and you get to keep them in peace conferences for free. However, you only get 75% of their military and civilian factories. You get no dockyards at all, and you have to buy resources. Some of the resources can be traded away to third parties, and taking resources gives the puppet autonomy that needs to be dealt with at some point. Compare this to normal occupations, where you get up to 100% of all the factories and dockyards. You get up to 105% of the resources without needing to pay for them, but you do need a garrison, you have reduced build slots, and you only get to use about 25% of the manpower, although in most cases that will be even lower for reasons mentioned previously. Overall, I found that collaboration governments work best as a manpower sponge that you can tap into before peace conferences fire. This is especially true for fascist nations, which have default puppets that have really bad penalties to recruitable population. Using collaboration puppets sidesteps that issue quite nicely. I hope this video has given you some insight into how resistance and compliance work, and some strategies for dealing with them. Until next time, my name's Riemann, and thanks for watching.